The lights had gone out. It was not the first time the fuses had failed in the house on the Rue Bruyère. It would not have been a remarkable thing, a flicker, a pop, the sudden swallowing of the rooms into winter darkness, had the evening not already carried a particular heaviness to it. The kind of heaviness that settles into old stone houses in February, when the cold outside is absolute and the warmth within feels provisional. Borrowed, likely to be reclaimed. Madame Lancelin had returned home with her daughter Geneviève, expecting supper laid and lamps burning. She found neither. She found darkness and the smell of cold iron, and the silence of a house that had already changed. On the first-floor landing, 2 figures waited. Christine and Léa Papin had served this household for years without incident. They had swept the same floors, polished the same silver, risen before dawn and retired after the family had settled. They had been, by every account, invisible in the way that excellent servants learn to be invisible. Present without presence, efficient without personality, their inner lives as inaccessible to their employers as the rooms behind locked doors. The doors were no longer locked. The lights were out across the whole of the street, and what happened next in that house would not be understood for a very long time, if ever. Chapter 1. The House on the Rue Bruyère. Welcome and good evening. Or perhaps it is later than that where you are. Perhaps the hour has already ticked past midnight, and the house around you has grown still, and the only sound is the particular silence that belongs to the deep of night, when the world outside has withdrawn into itself and left you alone with the dark and the quiet. Wherever you are listening from, whatever the hour reads on the clock beside you, you are welcome here. This is the Bedside Historian, and this is the place where history's quieter, stranger, more unsettling chapters are read aloud for those who find that the past, whispered gently in the dark, is the surest path towards sleep. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, pause for just a moment and do so now. It costs nothing, and it means that stories like this one will continue to find their way to you in the nights ahead. It helps more than you might imagine, and it is deeply appreciated. Now, tell us, if you will, where you are listening from tonight, and what time it is there. The world is large, and the night falls differently across it, and there is something comforting in knowing that voices carry across all of it, across all that distance, into all those different darknesses. Now, let us go back. Let us go back to France, to the winter of the early 1930s, to a provincial city that sat in the valley of the Sarthe River and had been sitting there, quietly and without particular distinction, for a very long time. Le Mans was not Paris. It had none of the capital's restlessness, none of its hunger for novelty or scandal or the overturning of established things. Le Mans was a city of lawyers and merchants and manufacturers, of cathedral spires and cobbled streets and the kind of bourgeois order that presented itself to the world as natural, as inevitable, as the only sensible arrangement of human life. Its houses were solid and stone-built, their shutters painted in muted colours, their interiors arranged according to conventions that had not changed in 3 generations. There were parlours and dining rooms and kitchens. There were good china sets kept behind glass, and silver candlesticks that required weekly polishing, and linen that was pressed with a flat iron heated on the kitchen stove. There were, in most houses of the better sort, servants. The house at number 6, the Rue Bruyère, was such a house, and it belonged to a man named René Lancelin. Lancelin was a retired solicitor, a man of property and standing, possessed of the quiet self-assurance that comes to those who have spent their professional lives navigating the written laws of civilized society and have never once had cause to doubt that those laws were arranged in their favour. He was in his 60s by the early 1930s, a widower in the legal sense only. His wife Léonie was very much alive, very much present, and very much the mistress of the household that bore his name. They had a daughter, Geneviève, who was grown and unmarried, and who lived with them in the manner of unmarried daughters of that class and era, occupying the spaces of the family home with the particular gravity of someone whose life had not yet quite begun. The house itself was of the kind Le Mans produced in abundance, 3 stories of pale stone behind a modest iron gate, its rooms communicating in the French fashion, its windows overlooking a street that was neither grand nor mean, simply settled, simply there, as the house itself had always simply been there. The ground floor held the kitchen and the utility rooms, the spaces of labour and preparation that existed to service the floors above. The first floor held the family's rooms, the parlour where Madame Lancelin received callers, the dining room where the family took their meals, the bedroom where the couple slept under heavy linen, and did not speak of intimate things. Above these, the attic rooms, small and low-ceilinged and unheated in winter, where the servants slept. The servants in the winter of 1933 were two sisters. Their names were Christine and Léa Papin, and they had been in service at the Lancelin house for several years by the time the events of February arrived. Christine was the elder, born in 1905 in the département of the Sardais, which made her a local woman in the broadest sense. She knew this landscape, this light, the particular grey quality of the sky above the valley in winter. She was tall, dark-haired, physically strong in the way of women accustomed to heavy domestic labour, with a face that those who encountered her described as unremarkable when still and something else entirely when animated. Léa was 6 years younger, born in 1911, smaller and softer in appearance, less defined in personality, more yielding in manner. Where Christine moved through a room with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew precisely what was required of her, Léa followed, assisted, completed. They were, in the particular economy of their small shared life, a single functioning unit. They slept in the attic. They took their meals in the kitchen. They did not socialize with the other servants of the street, did not attend the local dances or the seasonal fairs, did not, as far as anyone could determine, seek out the company of anyone outside the walls of the house on the Rue Bruyère. This was noted by the neighbours in retrospect with the particular clarity that retrospect provides, the clarity that colours everything it touches with the significance of what came after. At the time, the sisters' isolation was simply a feature of the household, unremarkable in itself, perhaps even desirable from an employer's perspective. Servants who had no social life outside the house had no distractions. They were available. They were present. They were, in the language of the class that employed them, reliable. Christine was considered the better servant of the two. The household accounts were impeccable under her management. The floors were clean, the silver was bright, the meals arrived at table at their appointed hours. Madame Lancelin was known among her acquaintance as a woman of exacting standards, and it was understood in the social circle of the Rue Bruyère and its neighbouring streets that the Lancelin household ran with admirable efficiency. This efficiency had a face, and that face belonged to Christine Papin, who rose before the family and retired after them and moved through the rooms of the house with the trained invisibility of the professional domestic. Léa's role was subordinate in the way that younger sisters' roles so often were in the domestic service of that era. She assisted Christine with the heavier work, the laundry, the scrubbing of floors on hands and knees, the carrying of coal scuttles up from the cellar in the mornings when the temperature had dropped overnight and the iron stove in the kitchen needed feeding before any other work could begin. The coal scuttle was a heavy thing, a dull black iron bucket with a handle that bit into the palm, and Léa carried it up the kitchen stairs every morning in winter with the unthinking repetition of someone who has performed the same task so many times that it has ceased to register as a task and become simply the way that mornings begin. The weight of it, the smell of coal dust in the cold air, the sound of the stove accepting the fuel and beginning, slowly, to tick and sigh with warmth. These were the textures of the sisters' days. The flat iron sliding across pressed linen, the soft bristle of the carpet brush on the parlour floor, the particular smell of the Lancelin kitchen in the late afternoon, when the day's cooking had settled into the walls and the light through the small window had turned the colour of weak tea. The sound of Madame Lancelin's footsteps above, crossing the first-floor landing in the mid-morning, the soft knock of her heels on the wooden boards that told Christine, without any explicit communication, that the mistress was awake and the day had properly begun, and all that was required of the two women in the kitchen and the rooms below was to continue, silently and without error, the work that was expected of them. Monsieur Lancelin, by the 1930s, was a man whose life had achieved the particular stasis of late middle age in comfortable circumstances. He had practiced his profession, accumulated his property, fulfilled his social obligations. He belonged to the right clubs, dined with the right people, maintained the right opinions on the matters that were discussed in the drawing rooms of Le Mans. He was not, by temperament or habit, a man who concerned himself greatly with the domestic interior of his own house. That was his wife's domain, and she administered it with the thoroughness of someone who had been trained to believe that the management of a household was both a serious duty and a measure of personal worth. What Monsieur Lancelin knew of the two sisters who kept his house was what he needed to know. They were efficient, they were quiet, they gave no trouble. The street itself was quiet in the way of provincial streets in winter. The plane trees that lined it had dropped their leaves months before and stood bare against the grey sky. their branches dividing the pale winter light into thin strips that fell across the stone faces of the houses without warming them. In the mornings, the tradespeople passed along it, the baker's boy with his basket, the coal merchant's cart drawn by a horse whose breath came in white clouds in the cold air, and then the street settled into its daytime silence, broken only by the footsteps of the occasional passer-by and the sound of shutters being opened or closed at the appointed hours. It was a street that nothing ever happened in. It was a street that had not, in the memory of any of its inhabitants, produced anything that could not be explained by the ordinary operations of bourgeois provincial life. Births and deaths and marriages and the quiet passing of the years. The occasional minor scandal, absorbed and forgotten. The slow accumulation of respectability, laid down in layers over the decades, like the sediment at the bottom of the Salve, invisible and undisturbed. And into this stillness, sometime in the late 1920s, had come two sisters from the countryside, carrying between them a single trunk of belongings, their references folded carefully inside a brown paper envelope, their faces composed into the expression of careful neutrality that domestic service required of its entrance. They had come, as so many came, from nothing very much. From a childhood that had not been easy, from a mother who had not stayed, from institutions that had given them skills in place of love, from a world that had decided their trajectory before they were old enough to understand that trajectories could be decided. They had come to keep a house, and they had kept it for years in silence and in order, in the cold attic rooms above the family that employed them, in the kitchen that smelled of cooking and coal, in the parlour that they polished and then withdrew from, in the Rue Bruyère that held them without knowing them, without asking anything of them except that they continue, day after day, to be invisible and efficient and good. The house was very quiet. It had always been very quiet. It would not be quiet much longer. Chapter 2. Children of the Institution. There is a particular kind of childhood that leaves no photographs, not because no one thought to take them, but because there was no one present who might have thought of such a thing. No parent standing at the edge of a garden with the afternoon light falling just so, no grandmother preserving the moment of a birthday or a first communion with the careful self-consciousness of families who believe their happiness is worth recording. The Papin children had no such photographs. What they had instead were records, institutional records, the cold administrative notations of a system that processed children as it processed everything else, efficiently and without sentiment, entering their names in ledgers and assigning them to dormitories and measuring their progress against criteria that had nothing to do with happiness or flourishing, and everything to do with usefulness. Christine Papin was born on the 8th of March 1905 in Mayenne, in the département of the Sarthe. Her father was Gustave Papin, a road labourer, a man of physical strength and very little else, whose relationship to stability was, at best, occasional. Her mother was Clémence Deray, a woman whose own childhood had not been notably warmer than the one she would provide for her children, and who brought to the business of motherhood a quality of indifference that was not, perhaps, cruelty in a difference that was not, perhaps, cruelty in a deliberate sense, but was cruelty in its effects, which amounted to the same thing when experienced from the inside. There were other children, an older daughter named Amelia, and then Christine, and then, 6 years after Christine in 1911, another daughter named Léa. The family was not a family in any functional sense. It was a collection of individuals connected by blood and by the administrative fact of having shared, for certain periods, the same address. Gustave Papin's presence was intermittent and violent. He drank in the manner of men who drink to resolve the problem of being themselves, which is to say, he drank consistently and without resolution. The details of what Christine and Léa witnessed in those early years are not fully recoverable from the historical record, but the shape of the household can be inferred from what came after, from the psychiatric examinations, the court testimonies, the observations of the alienists who were brought in to explain two women who had done something that the world found it very difficult to explain. Amelia, the eldest daughter, was the first to leave. She was sent to a religious institution, one of the many establishments run by the Catholic orders that had, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, assumed responsibility for the children that French society produced and could not, or would not, keep. These institutions operated according to a philosophy that might be summarized, without much distortion, as follows. A child without a family was a child without a future, and the most merciful thing that could be done for such a child was to train them, early and thoroughly, for the only kind of life that would be open to them. For girls, that life was domestic service. The training was comprehensive. It covered cooking, laundering, the care of linen, the proper method of laying a table, the correct way to address an employer, the importance of silence when silence was required, and the absolute necessity of effacing oneself completely in the presence of one's betters. Amelia went. Then Christine went. Christine was 7 years old when she was placed in the care of the religious authorities. The establishment that received her was the orphanage of Le Bon Pasteur, the Good Shepherd, a name that carried the full weight of Catholic institutional self-regard, its implication of safety and guidance obscuring, as such names tend to do, the reality of the place it designated. The Bon Pasteur was not a cruel place in the theatrical sense. There were no dramatic abuses, no gothic horrors written into its record. It was simply a place of tremendous orderliness, of routine imposed with the confidence of those who believe that the imposition of routine is an act of charity, of warmth withheld, not from malice, but from a theology of discipline that understood suffering as instructive and comfort as a temptation to be resisted. Christine slept in a dormitory of iron beds, each one separated from the next by exactly the same distance, each one dressed in the same grey-white linen that smelled of the industrial laundry in the building's lower floors. She rose at 5 in the morning when the bell rang, dressed in the prescribed fashion, attended Mass in the institution's chapel before the winter light had fully entered the high narrow windows above the altar. The chapel smelled of incense and cold stone, and the particular staleness of a space that is occupied by the devout every morning and never fully aired. She knelt on wooden kneelers that bit into the bone of the knee with a persistence that the nuns, perhaps, considered spiritually useful. She prayed the required prayers in the required order. She ate the prescribed meals, a thin soup in the mornings, a more substantial one at midday, bread in the evenings, sitting at long refectory tables where silence was the rule in conversation, a privilege extended on certain feast days and revoked without particular explanation. She learned to cook and to clean and to press linen and to keep accounts. She learned the hierarchy of domestic spaces, which rooms were to be entered and in what order, which tasks preceded which other tasks, how to move through a house inhabited by people who wish not to be aware of the mechanisms that kept it functioning. She learned, above all, to be quiet, to contain herself, to present to the world a surface that was smooth and unreadable and gave nothing away. This is what Le Bon Pasteur made of Christine Papin, and it made it thoroughly. Léa arrived later, when she was too young to have formed memories of a life before institutions. She was placed, in the early 1920s, in the care of the same system that had received her sisters, and she moved through its requirements with the compliance of someone who has never known anything else, and therefore has no basis for comparison. If Christine's institutional formation had produced a woman of contained intensity, of something wound tightly beneath the smooth surface, Léa's had produced something more yielding, more passive, a woman whose identity had been shaped almost entirely in relation to others rather than from any strong internal centre. She was agreeable. She was capable. She did what was required of her, and she did it well, and she did not, as far as anyone could observe, want very much beyond the continuation of the conditions she already had. Their mother, Clémence, had not been passive in her abandonment of her children. She had been, in her own way, deliberate. When Christine was old enough to leave the institution and enter service, Clémence had made attempts to extract money from her daughter's wages, a detail that lodges itself in the mind like a splinter. That particular transaction between a mother and the system that had raised her children in her absence, the ease with which Clémence positioned herself to benefit from labour she had taken no part in producing. Christine had, for a time, submitted to these extractions. She had sent money home. She had maintained the fiction of filial obligation toward a woman who had discharged none of her own. What this cost Christine in some interior accounting that no one could fully access is not recoverable. What is recoverable is the fact that at some point, sometime in the middle 1920s, around the time that both sisters were placed together in their first joint domestic position, Christine stopped sending money. She severed contact with her mother, quietly and without drama, as she did everything. She turned toward Léa, and Léa turned toward her, and they arranged themselves into the only family either of them had ever truly had. Amelia, the eldest sister, had taken a different path. She had remained within the church's embrace, had become a nun, and had disappeared into a life of religious enclosure from which she sent no letters and received no visits. She was, for all practical purposes, gone, absorbed into a vocation that was also, perhaps an escape from the same childhood that had shaped her younger sisters in different ways. Christine and Léa did not speak of Amelia. She was another closed door in a life that had more closed doors than open ones. What the institution had given them beyond the technical skills of domestic service was each other. This is not nothing. In the dormitories and refectories and laundry rooms of Le Bon Pasteur, where warmth was structural rather than personal, where the closest thing to affection available to an institutional child was the approval of a supervising nun, expressed through the absence of correction, the sisters had found in one another something that no established authority had provided, and no training had accounted for. They had found a person whose presence made the world feel less entirely cold. Christine had been protective of Léa from the beginning. In the institutional setting, where the weak were not necessarily preyed upon in dramatic ways, but were simply worn down by the cumulative weight of a system that had no mechanism for recognizing individual need, the presence of an older sibling willing to stand between the younger and the friction of institutional life was not a small thing. Christine had stood between. She had negotiated, had smoothed, had quietly arranged things so that the worst of what the system offered fell more heavily on herself and less heavily on her younger sister. Léa had accepted this. She had, in the manner of those who receive consistent protection, stopped developing the defenses that the unprotected are forced to construct. By the time they entered service together, they had become something that is difficult to describe precisely in the language that was available to those who later tried to describe it. They were sisters, yes. They were companions, yes. They were the only continuity in each other's lives, the only witnesses to each other's histories, the only people alive who knew where the other had come from and what it had cost to come from there. But they were also in some way that the alienists would later struggle to articulate and the newspapers would distort with the available vocabulary of their era, a single thing that happened to occupy two bodies. What one felt, the other registered. What one needed, the other understood before it was spoken. There was no privacy between them because the concept had never applied. They had grown up in dormitories, had shared every space and every rhythm, had never developed the habit of interior life as something separate from the life they shared. This is what arrived at the house on the Rue Bruyère. Not two women in any separate and individual sense. A unit. An entity of two parts that functioned according to its own internal logic, that had never needed to develop the skills of relation with the outside world, because the only relationship that mattered existed entirely within itself. The institution had made them efficient and obedient and silent and useful, as it also made them entirely alone in the world, except for each other, and it had given them no tools whatsoever for managing what that meant. A speak. Chapter 3. The architecture of obedience France in the 1930s was a country that believed in its own orderliness. This belief was held most firmly by those who benefited most from the arrangement, the provincial bourgeoisie, that broad stratum of merchants and professionals and property owners who had, since the revolutionary settlement, understood themselves to be the true backbone of the republic, the class that had displaced the aristocracy not by destroying the hierarchies that the aristocracy had maintained, but by repositioning themselves at the top of those hierarchies and declaring the repositioning the victory for reason. They were orderly people. They kept orderly houses. They maintained orderly relations with those below them on the social scale, which is to say they maintained those relations on terms that suited themselves and called the maintenance of those terms civilization. Domestic service was central to this civilization. In the interwar period, despite the disruptions of the Great War and the social shifts it had produced, a significant proportion of French households of the bourgeois class employed at least one live-in servant. In the better houses of provincial cities like Le Mans, 2 or 3 servants was not unusual. A cook, perhaps a housemaid, perhaps a bonne d'affaires, a maid of all work, who filled whatever function the household required. The arrangement was ancient, and the codes that governed it were ancient also, transmitted not through any written document, but through the accumulated practice of generations, through the 1,000 small gestures and habits and deferrals that structured the daily life of a household, organized around the distinction between those who were served and those who served. A servant in such a household occupied a space that was genuinely difficult to define. She was inside the family home. She moved through its rooms. She handled its most intimate objects. She knew the texture of the family's daily life in a way that no visitor or acquaintance could know it. And yet, she was entirely outside the family. She was present in the rooms, but not of them. She was aware of the family's rhythms, their moods, their preferences, their small domestic arguments, the state of their health, the quality of their sleep. But none of this awareness was acknowledged. It existed in a kind of enforced silence, accumulated and unspoken, filed away in the servant's interior where it could not be used, could not be shared, could not be processed through any of the normal channels of human social exchange. The meals illustrated this most starkly. The family ate in the dining room, at the table that the servant had set with a prescribed arrangement of silverware and crystal. The servant carried the dishes from the kitchen, set them on the table, withdrew, returned when required, cleared the plates when the family was finished. She did not eat at that table. She ate in the kitchen at a different table from different dishes, and she ate after the family had finished or before they had begun, depending on the household schedule, in any case alone or with any other servants the household employed, in the space below the floors that the family inhabited. The kitchen was her space in a way that no other space in the house was. It was below, and it was plain, and it was defined by function. By the stove and the preparation surfaces and the wooden table and the smell of whatever had been cooked that day. And it was where she spent the majority of her hours. Christine and Léa Papin inhabited this architecture completely. They had been trained to inhabit it, had been prepared for it from early childhood, had arrived at the Lancelin house already fluent in its codes and requirements. Christine managed the household with a precision that Madame Lancelin valued and acknowledged in the way that employers of that class and era acknowledged good service, which is to say with its continued expectation, with the assumption that the standard would be maintained, with a particular form of approval that is expressed not as praise but as the absence of criticism. The wages paid to the sisters were modest. Christine earned slightly more than Léa, reflecting her status as the senior servant and the greater scope of her responsibilities. The amounts were in keeping with the going rate for domestic servants in a provincial French city in the late 1920s and early 1930s, sufficient for survival within the household, where food and lodging were provided, but constituting almost nothing as independent income, almost nothing as a resource that could be converted into freedom or choice, or the capacity to imagine a different life. The sisters spent very little. They had almost nowhere to go, and almost nothing they needed to buy. Their wages accumulated in a savings account at the local post office, building toward a sum that had no particular purpose attached to it, that was simply there, the way that saved things are simply there in the lives of people who save out of habit rather than intention. The attic rooms where they slept were small and adequately furnished in the plain manner of servants' quarters. An iron bed, a wooden chest, a basin and ewer for washing, a single window that gave onto the rooftops of the street. In winter, the rooms were cold. The chill that settled into the upper floors of stone houses in the Sarthe Valley, when the temperature dropped, was the dense, still cold of walls that had no insulation and no heating. And it lay on the skin in the mornings like a second sheet, to be shrugged off only gradually, as the body's own warmth reasserted itself, and the day's work began to generate heat. Christine and Léa dressed in the cold and descended the back stairs to the kitchen, and the kitchen fire was the first warmth of the day, and it was they who had made it. There were rules in the Lancelin household that were never written down and never spoken aloud, but were as fixed as the stone walls of the building. The sisters did not enter the family's rooms except to clean them. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not use the main staircase. They did not sit in the parlour or the dining room. They did not open the glass cabinet that held Madame Lancelin's collection of small decorative objects, porcelain figurines, a set of painted fans, things of no great monetary value, but of the significance that accumulated objects carry in the lives of their owners, the significance of having been chosen and arranged and kept. These objects required dusting, and Christine dusted them with the careful, habituated handling of someone who has been taught that the things belonging to an employer are more valuable than the hands that care for them, not because the objects are worth more than the hands that care for them, not because the objects are worth more than the hands in any objective sense, but because the hierarchy of the household has invested them with a gravity that must be respected. Madame Lancelin was a precise woman. Precision was, for her, a form of authority, the precision of the standard she set, the precision of her inspection of the work done to meet that standard, the precision of her identification of any deviation from it. She examined the surfaces that Christine had cleaned. She ran a finger along the edge of a shelf, held the finger to the light, considered what the light revealed. If it revealed nothing, the inspection ended. If it revealed anything, a trace of dust, a smear on the glass of the cabinet, a piece of silver not fully bright, the deviation was noted, and Christine was informed of it in the toneless manner of a woman who does not raise her voice because raising one's voice is vulgar, but who makes her displeasure felt through other means. Christine absorbed these inspections without visible response. She did not argue, did not explain, did not offer the context that might have mitigated the fact that she had cleaned that surface twice already that day, the fact that the condensation from the kitchen made certain surfaces impossible to keep perfectly dry, the fact that she had been awake since 5 in the morning and it was now past 9 in the evening. None of this was relevant to the inspection. The inspection was about the surface, and the surface was about the standard, and the standard was about the relationship between the woman who set it and the women who were required to meet it, and that relationship had only one direction. What Christine thought during these inspections is not recoverable. She did not write letters that survive. She did not, as far as the record shows, speak to anyone outside the household about her experience of life within it. She existed in the kitchen and the attic and the room she cleaned, and her interior life was as invisible as her labour, as unremarked upon, as thoroughly excluded from the account that the household kept of itself. What can be observed from the outside is the shape of the life, the repetition of it. The same stove, lit each morning. The same floors, swept and then swept again. The same silver, polished until the face looking back from it was distorted, broadened, made strange by the curve of the metal. The same stairs, the back stairs, taken in the same direction at the same hours. The same window in the attic, with the same rooftops outside it. The same winter sky above the rooftops. The same cold that settled in through the walls after dark. Year after year. The world outside the house went about its business. The 1930s arrived with their particular atmosphere of unease. The Depression had reached France, unemployment was rising, the political atmosphere in Paris and beyond it was increasingly turbulent. The anxieties of a continent that had not fully recovered from one catastrophe were accumulating toward the next. None of this entered the Rue Bruyère in any form that disrupted the Lancelin household's routines. Monsieur Lancelin read his newspaper in the parlour after breakfast. Madame Lancelin called on her acquaintances and received calls in return. Geneviève occupied herself in the quiet, indistinct manner of a young woman in a household where young women had not yet found their place in any worlds beyond the household itself. And in the kitchen, and on the stairs, and in the attic rooms, Christine and Léa continued. They had been continuing for so long that the continuation had become the totality of their lives. There was nothing outside it. There was no before that they could return to, and no after that they could envision. There was only the house, and the work, and each other, and the silence that held all of it together. It was a silence that had weight. It was a silence that, in time, would become impossible to maintain. Ab chapter 4, the bond between them. There is a French word, complicité, that carries more weight than its English cognate. Complicity in English suggests wrongdoing. Two people joined by their shared participation in something they ought not to have done. In French, the word is broader, older, deeper in its roots. It speaks of a connection so thorough that the boundaries between two people become permeable, that what one person thinks the other receives, that what one person feels the other contains within themselves, without needing to be told. It is the word that came, eventually, to be used about Christine and Léa Papin, and it was the right word, and the horror of the case made it seem like the wrong one. But the horror did not change the word's accuracy. It only changed the colour in which the word appeared. To understand what happened on the evening of the 2nd of February 1933, it is necessary to understand, as fully as the surviving record allows, the nature of the bond between the sisters, and to understand that bond it is necessary to understand what it was built from, and what it was built in lieu of. Neither Christine nor Léa had ever, by any evidence available, formed a significant attachment outside their relationship with each other. This was not, in its origins, a choice. It was a condition imposed on them by the circumstances of their childhood, the absence of the parents who might have been their first attachments, the institutional setting that had substituted routine for intimacy, the sequence of placements and transfers, and the kind of childhood that ends not in the gradual opening of the world, but in its narrowing, its steady reduction to the manageable, the survivable, the small. Other children in similar circumstances had managed to form connections beyond the family of origin, friendships in the institutions, bonds with particular nuns or supervisors who had shown some quality of individual attention, relationships formed in subsequent employment with other servants or with the young people of the neighborhoods where they worked. Christine and Léa had not done this. Or rather, Christine had not done it, and Léa, whose social impulses existed but required Christine's permission to be acted upon, had followed her sister's lead. Christine was not by temperament a woman who sought the company of strangers. The neighbors of the Rue Bruyère who recalled the Papin sisters in later interviews described Christine as reserved to the point of opacity, not rude, not unfriendly in any active sense, simply inaccessible. She did not offer herself. She responded to what was required of her and then withdrew. The withdrawal was not sullenness. It was the trained containment of a woman who had learned very early that the safest posture in the world was the one that gave the least away. There was, among the servants of the neighbouring households, a kind of informal social world that operated in the marginal hours. In the early mornings when the baker's deliveries brought the maids of the street briefly into contact with one another at their respective kitchen doors, in the occasional afternoon when the mistress was out and the time could be spent less rigidly. Gossip was exchanged in these small windows, small alliances formed and dissolved. The social texture of the street's below-stairs life woven in fragments stolen from the larger fabric of service. Christine did not participate in this world. She received the baker's delivery and closed the kitchen door. Léa, who might have drifted toward this informal sociality, stayed inside with her sister. Their hours off, they were entitled to one afternoon per week. The standard arrangement for live-in domestics of the period was spent, as far as anyone could later establish, in each other's company in the attic rooms. They did not attend Mass regularly, which was itself slightly unusual for women of their background and training, suggesting that the religious formation they had received at Le Bon Pasteur had not produced in them the habit of devotion so much as the habit of compliance, and that compliance, once the institution that required it had been left behind, dissolved rather than persisted. They did not go to the cinema, did not walk in the parks, did not spend their afternoons in the cafes where the working people of Le Mans took their leisure. They stayed in the attic. What they did in the attic is a question that the alienists who examined them, the journalists who wrote about the case, and the intellectuals who subsequently theorized about it, all attempted to answer, and none answered satisfactorily, because the answer requires access to an interior that was never made available. What is known as the physical fact of their proximity. They shared the attic space, shared their hours, shared their small savings, shared, by all accounts, a life that was as thoroughly communal as any life can be between two people who are not, in the conventional sense, lovers. The question of whether Christine and Léa were lovers in that conventional sense was raised at the trial, pursued by the examining alienists, debated in the press, and eventually resolved in the way that such questions tend to be resolved when the evidence is insufficient to compel a definitive answer, with the projection of the error's own anxieties onto an ambiguity that the evidence would not clarify. Some of the alienists were certain, others were uncertain. Christine, when asked, responded with what was variously described as indignation, confusion, and calm deflection. Léa, when asked, said what Christine's expression told her to say. The historical record does not permit a confident conclusion, and the uncertainty has remained in the decades since as one of the case's persistent, unresolved questions. What is less contested is the functional reality of the attachment. Christine was Léa's world, and Léa was Christine's, and the world beyond this dyad had never been particularly real to either of them. This created a system of extraordinary internal stability and extraordinary external fragility. Internally, within the two-person world they had constructed, the sisters knew precisely how things were and what was expected, and how to move and what to say. They had developed over years of shared living the non-verbal communication of people who have spent so much time together that language becomes redundant for most purposes. A glance, a pause, a particular quality of stillness that communicated what needed to be communicated without the risk of being overheard or misunderstood. Externally, in the larger world of the house, the street, the city, they were, in a meaningful sense, defenseless. The mechanisms that most people develop through social exposure, through the trial and error of relationship with multiple different people across different contexts, through the gradual calibration of their responses to the world's feedback. These mechanisms were undeveloped in both sisters, in Christine because she had chosen not to develop them, both sisters, in Christine because she had chosen not to develop them, in Léa because Christine had not needed her to. They had each other, and each other had always been sufficient, and the sufficiency of each other had made everything outside each other seem not quite necessary. This is not a pathology at its roots. It is a human response to deprivation. When the ordinary sources of attachment and warmth are unavailable, people find what warmth they can in what is available. Christine and Léa had found it in each other, and the warmth had been real, and it had sustained them through a childhood that was genuinely difficult and a working life that was genuinely isolating. What made it dangerous, what made the same bond that had saved them also the thing that would undo them, was its exclusivity, its totality, the fact that it had no outside to balance it, no other relationships to distribute its intensity across, no context in which either sister was required to be a separate person with a separate interior life. Christine, in this arrangement, was the dominant force. Not through any explicit assertion of authority. There was no command structure between them, no formal hierarchy. The dominance was structural, prior, written into the relationship from its beginnings in the institution where Christine had been the older and the protector, and the one who understood how things worked and communicated that understanding to her younger sister. Léa had always followed. Not out of fear, not out of coercion, but out of the deep habit of a person whose primary mode of being in the world was to orient herself toward someone else and allow that orientation to define her. When Christine was calm, the attic rooms were calm. When Christine was content with the work and the day had passed without incident and Madame Lancelin's inspection had found nothing to note, the kitchen and the attic and the shared hours of the evening had a particular quality of warmth to them. The warmth of two people who are sufficient to each other, who have built a small and precarious peace and are, for the moment, successfully maintaining it. When Christine was not calm, when the accumulated weight of the day had been heavier than usual, when some interaction with the household had left its mark in the particular tightening around her eyes that Léa recognized and understood, the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically. Christine did not shout, did not weep, did not perform her distress in any way that would have been visible to the family above. She contained it. But Léa felt the containment as keenly as she would have felt any open expression. She responded to it, adjusted to it, shaped herself around it, and waited for it to pass. It always passed. And then things were as they had been, and the work continued, and the attic rooms held them through another night, and the stove needed lighting again in the morning, and the coal scuttle was heavy, and the silver needed polishing, until the night when it did not pass. Until the night when what had been contained could no longer be contained, and the house on the Rue Bruyère, which had held them and also imprisoned them for years, became the place where everything that had been wound so tightly, finally, irrevocably, gave. Chapter 5. A household without warmth. Léonie Lancelin was not a cruel woman in any way that she would have recognized as cruelty. This is an important distinction, and it is one that the historical record of the case requires. There were no beatings, no documented episodes of violent abuse, no systematic deprivation of food or sleep or the basic conditions of survivable existence. The Lancelin household was not, by the standards of its era or by any objective measure of the term, a brutal place. What it was, and this is more difficult to articulate and perhaps more difficult to absorb precisely because it lacks the clean lines of obvious wrongdoing, was a place entirely without warmth, in the specific sense of warmth, as something directed from the powerful toward the powerless, from the served toward those who served. Madame Lancelin was in her middle 50s in the early 1930s, a woman who had arrived at the age where character has fully hardened into its final form and presents itself to the world without apology. She had grown up in the comfortable bourgeoisie of provincial France, had married appropriately, had managed her household with the thoroughness of someone who had been taught that household management was a serious duty and had taken the lesson seriously. She was precise, as has been noted. She was demanding, in the particular way of people who have never had cause to question whether their demands are reasonable, because their demands have always been met. She was not imaginative in her understanding of other people's experience, which is itself a form of limitation that tends to be invisible to those who possess it. The imagination required to step into another person's life and feel its weight from the inside was not a faculty that her own formation had developed or encouraged. She examined the work that Christine did and found it satisfactory or did not find it satisfactory, and in neither case did she consider what the work had cost. Cost, in this sense, the cost of rising before dawn, of physical labor sustained across the full length of a day, of the particular exhaustion of work that is never finished because the surfaces that are cleaned will be dirtied again, and the silver that is polished will tarnish, and the floors that are swept will accumulate the day's dust again, by evening. This cost was simply not part of the accounting that Madame Lancelin kept. The work was what the work was. and it was what Christine was employed to do, and its completion was the baseline expectation, and its failure to meet the standard was a deficiency, and its meeting of the standard was simply normal. Gratitude was not extended. The concept, as it might apply in the direction from employer to servant, was genuinely foreign to the household's emotional economy. Gratitude implies a recognition that something has been given, that the giving has been a choice rather than a requirement, that the person who has given it has conferred something worth acknowledging. In the Lancelin household's understanding of the transaction, Christine and Léa had not given anything. They had fulfilled their contracted obligations. One does not thank a stove for producing heat, and one does not thank a servant for performing the work for which she is paid. The wages, as noted, were modest. There is one detail from the financial record of the household that is worth dwelling on. When the electrical repairs became necessary, as they periodically did in a house of that age, with the somewhat unreliable electrical installation French provincial housing of the period was prone to, the cost of the repair was on at least one occasion deducted from the wages of the servants on the grounds that the fault had been caused by their misuse of the servants, on the grounds that the fault had been caused by their misuse of the household's electrical appliances. Whether this deduction was legally or even factually justified is a question the record does not fully answer. What the record does show is that it was made, and that it was not contested, and that it sat in the household's account of itself as a reasonable adjustment. Christine noted these deductions. She did not speak of them, did not dispute them, maintain the smooth, unreadable surface through which the household's understanding of events passed without encountering friction, but she noted them. The interior account that she kept, the accumulating ledger of the unexpressed, the uncontested, the swallowed, was not accessible to anyone in the Lancelin household, was not accessible to the neighbours, was not accessible to the alienists until after the fact, when its dimensions were inferred from what had finally come of it. Geneviève Lancelin was in her late 20s in the years before the murder, a young woman whose life had the quality of suspension that characterized the existence of unmarried daughters in bourgeois households of that period. She had been educated to a standard appropriate to her class, spoke some English, could play the piano with competence, had the social accomplishments that her mother considered necessary, and the absence of whatever it was that transformed those accomplishments into a life. She was not, by the accounts that survive, a dramatic personality. She was pleasant in the way of young women trained to pleasantness. Quiet in the manner of young women in households where the primary force of character belonged to the mother. Present without particularly pressing herself on the attention of those around her. Her relationship with the Papin sisters was essentially the same as her mother's, differing only in that she had somewhat less authority to exercise. She had grown up in a household where servants were a fact of the furniture, and she had absorbed this understanding completely, and she moved through the spaces that Christine and Léa cleaned with the unseeing ease of someone who has never had to consider the mechanism by which surfaces are kept clean. She left things for them to pick up. She changed her clothes and left the discarded garments for them to collect and launder and press and return to the wardrobe. She took her meals and left the table. She was not unkind to the sisters in any active sense. She simply did not see them, in the way that people do not see the infrastructure of their own comfort, when that infrastructure has always functioned perfectly and required nothing of them but its continuation. There is one detail that appears in the later testimony of the investigating magistrate that is worth noting here. When the neighbours were asked, in the aftermath of the murders, whether they had observed anything unusual in the Lancelin household in the weeks and months before February, several noted that the relationship between Christine and Madame Lancelin had, in the period leading up to the events of the second, taken on a quality of additional tension. The inspections had become more frequent. The standards applied had become, if anything, more exacting. There had been words. Not shouted, nothing so dramatic, but words in the cool, flat tone of a woman accustomed to expressing displeasure through precision, about the state of the ironwork on the landing, about the quality of the pressing on a particular blouse, about a smear on the window glass in the parlour that Christine insisted she had cleaned, and Madame Lancelin insisted she had not cleaned sufficiently. Whether these frictions were genuinely more numerous in the final months, or whether they only appeared so in retrospect, after the fact had given them a significance they would not otherwise have had, is impossible to determine with certainty. Memory is not a recording instrument. It is a constructive process, and it constructs in the light of what it knows, and what the neighbours knew by the time they were asked to remember was that these two women were dead, and the two women who had killed them had been living in the attic above. What can be established is the emotional atmosphere of the house in those final months of 1932 and the first weeks of 1933. It was an atmosphere of pressure, of the particular kind of pressure that builds in enclosed spaces where the ventilation is insufficient, not dramatically, not explosively, but steadily, in the manner of water finding the hairline cracks in stone, patient and invisible and enormously powerful when it finally finds a way through. Christine cleaned the house and was told with regularity that the house was not clean enough. She polished the silver and was told that the silver was not bright enough. She pressed the linen and was told that the linen was not pressed sufficiently. She carried the coal up from the cellar and lit the stoves and prepared the meals and set the table and cleared the table and washed the dishes and swept the floors and polished the furniture and laundered the clothes and hung them to dry in the small yard behind the kitchen, and then brought them in and pressed them and returned them to the wardrobes of people who wore them without thought. And for all of this, day after day in the cold months of that winter, she said nothing. Léa watched Christine. This is the core of the chapter, finally arrived at, the thing that all of this context has been building toward. Léa watched Christine in the way that she'd always watched Christine, with the total attention of someone whose primary instrument for navigating the world is the observation of the one person she trusts absolutely. And what Léa observed in those final months was something changing in the quality of Christine's containment. The same smooth surface. The same unreadable face turned toward Madame Lancelin's inspections, but beneath it, perceptible to Léa in ways that it was perceptible to no one else. In the slight alteration of Christine's breathing pattern, in the moments after a criticism, in the extra care with which she set down objects that she was carrying when her hands had been recently corrected, in the stillness of the attic evenings that was subtly different from the stillness that preceded it, something was present that had not always been present, or had not always been present at this intensity. The house held them in. The house had always held them in, and they had always allowed it to hold them, had understood the holding as simply the condition of their existence, the architecture within which their life together was lived, but walls that hold also press. And the pressing in the winter of 1932 going into 1933 had acquired a quality that was new. Madame Lancelin did not know this. There was no mechanism by which she could have known it. The surface that Christine presented was the surface of a functioning servant, adequate and present and meeting the required standards, and this was all that the household's instruments of perception were calibrated to detect. What lay beneath the surface was as invisible as the women themselves had always been, was, in a sense, simply more of the same invisibility, the invisibility that had been their condition since they had first entered service, that had been trained into them long before they arrived at the Rue Bruyère. That was the fundamental premise of the arrangement. The arrangement continued. The cold deepened in January. February arrived with its grey light and its wet air and its particular quality of an interminable winter, not yet near its end. And on the evening of the 2nd of February, the lights went out. Extract. Chapter 6. The Fuse. The afternoon of the 2nd of February 1933 was unremarkable in its early hours. The weather was the weather of the season, a flat cold, damp rather than sharp, the kind that settles in the joints and makes the body conscious of itself in ways that are merely uncomfortable rather than dramatic. The street was quiet in the way of Thursday afternoons in provincial cities. The working week not yet finished, the weekend not yet close enough to alter the atmosphere. In the house on the Rue Bruyère, the day had proceeded along its established lines. Christine had completed the morning's tasks, the fires, the breakfast, the clearing, the beginning of the afternoon's preparation, and Léa had assisted her, and the house had moved through its hours in the manner to which it was accustomed. Monsieur Lancelin was not in the house. He had business in the city, and would not return until the evening. Madame Lancelin and Geneviève had gone out earlier in the afternoon to call on friends, the family Renard, with whom they were on terms of the regular social exchange that constituted the rhythm of the Lancelin household's social life. They were expected back before supper. The house, in their absence, held only Christine and Léa. What transpired in the Lancelin household in the early part of that afternoon? What passed between the sisters in the kitchen? What was said or not said? What atmosphere prevailed in the rooms while the family was away? Is not recoverable from the historical record. Christine's confession, given to the examining magistrate in the immediate aftermath, began its account of events at the point of the electrical failure, and what preceded that failure in the interior life of the two women is available only through inference, through the long retrospective reading of everything that had been accumulating in the years before. What is established is that in the early evening, while Christine was engaged with an iron, using the flat iron heated on the kitchen stove to press linen, a task as ordinary and habitual as any other in her day, something went wrong with the electrical current. The specific cause has been attributed in various accounts to a fault in the iron itself, or to a fault in the wiring of the house's electrical system, which had a history of unreliability. The effect was immediate and total. The fuse for the first floor blew, and the lights in the upper rooms of the house on the Rue Bruyère went out. This was not the first time this had happened. The house had a fuse problem that was a matter of record, the same problem that had previously resulted in the deduction from the sisters' wages. Christine knew this. She had dealt with it before. She understood, with the clarity of someone who has been held financially responsible for a domestic failure, that the failure of the lights on an evening when the mistress was expected home was a situation that would require explanation and would likely require her to absorb the consequences of an explanation found insufficient. This understanding, its precise weight, the specific gravity of it in that particular moment in that particular woman after the accumulation of everything that had preceded it, is what the historical record cannot fully convey, and what every subsequent attempt to explain the events of that evening has struggled to account for. The fuse was, in one sense, a trivial thing. Electrical fuses fail. They are replaced. The incident is resolved. In another sense, in the sense of what it represented to Christine in the full context of her situation, her history, the household's financial penalties, Madame Lancelin's returning footsteps, the endless inspections, the endless weight of a life that had no exit and no acknowledged value. It was not trivial at all. It was not trivial at all. Madame Lancelin and Geneviève returned to the house at approximately 5:30 in the evening. They entered through the front door and found the upper hallway in darkness. Christine was on the first floor landing. What followed was reconstructed by the examining magistrate from Christine's confession, given the following morning in a state of apparent composure, without coercion, with a directness that those present at the interrogation described as remarkable in its steadiness. Christine was not, in the giving of her confession, a woman in the grip of shock or disorientation. She was precise. She was clear. She accounted for the events in the order in which they occurred, without embellishment, without deflection, and without any apparent attempt to reduce or qualify her own role in them. According to that confession, the exchange on the landing was brief. Madame Lancelin, encountering the darkness and encountering Christine, expressed her displeasure at the state of the house. The specific words are not preserved verbatim in the surviving record. The magistrate's notes render them in reported speech, but the substance is consistent across the various accounts. Madame Lancelin was angry. Her anger took the form it had always taken. The controlled, flat, precise form of a woman who does not shout, but whose dissatisfaction is communicated with a clarity that does not require volume to land with its full force. Christine attacked her. The weapon used first was the pot lid, a heavy iron implement from the kitchen, which Christine had been carrying, or which was within reach on the landing. She struck Madame Lancelin with it. Geneviève, who was present, cried out or attempted to intervene, and Christine turned on Geneviève as well. Léa, who had come up the stairs from the kitchen, joined her sister. The attack was not brief. It was sustained, and it was thorough, and it escalated through several stages, each one further beyond the previous, until what was taking place bore no resemblance to the proximate cause of a blown fuse and a sharp word on a landing. The instruments used in the attack included the pot lid, a hammer, and a knife. All of them were household objects, the tools of the kitchen, the tools of the work, the tools of the life that the sisters had lived in that house for years, repurposed now for something that the house had never been designed to contain. The gouging of the eyes. This is the detail that stopped France cold, that the newspapers would return to again and again in the weeks following, that the alienists would attempt to explain and the courts would attempt to contextualize and the intellectuals would attempt to theorize, was not incidental. It was deliberate, carried out by Christine in the case of both victims, with her bare hands and with a tool, in the full light of whatever light the landing had available to it at that hour. This act, more than any other element of the violence, shaped the public understanding of what had happened, and why, because it exceeded not just the physical bounds of the violence that had preceded it, but the conceptual bounds of what bourgeois France was prepared to believe was possible in the interior of one of its own households. The eyes. Madame Lancelin's eyes and Genevieve's eyes, gouged from their heads and placed. The word that the police report uses is placed, deliberately not scattered, on the floor of the landing. This detail requires no embellishment and tolerates none. It is simply what it is, which is one of the most disturbing single acts in the annals of the criminal history of France. And it is disturbing not because violence is unusual in historical record. The historical record is saturated with violence, but because of the intimacy of it, the proximity, the fact that the hands that had cleaned this house and polished these objects and served these women for years were the same hands that had done this after the violence was complete. And the record is not precise about the duration, but the physical evidence would later suggest that it had been neither swift nor contained. Christine and Léa withdrew to the attic. They barricaded the door with the furniture of their small room, a chest and a chair. The portable architecture of their domestic lives arranged now as a barricade. They cleaned themselves, or attempted to do so, in the basin and ewer that stood on the chest beside the window. They lay down together on the iron bed in the cold room above the landing, where the house's two mistresses lay dead, and they waited for what was coming. Christine, by her own subsequent account, was calm. The calm was not the absence of awareness. She knew precisely what she had done and what it would bring. It was the calm, perhaps, of something that has been too long held, finally released. The specific relief of a pressure that has been building for so long that its release, even in this form, carries within it a quality of completion. She had not planned this. A history of the case offers no evidence of premeditation in any formal sense. What it offers instead is something harder to account for within the available legal categories. The sense of an inevitability arrived at, of a pressure that had reached the limit of what the containing vessel could bear, and had found, in a moment of ordinary domestic friction, the crack it needed. Léa lay beside her sister. The house was dark and still. Outside, the street continued in its ordinary evening way, unaware of what the stone walls around it contained. Monsieur Lancelin was on his way home. I gaffed him. Chapter 7. What was found? René Lancelin arrived at the house on the Rue Bruyère sometime in the early evening and found it dark. This was unusual enough to register. The house was never entirely dark at the hour when the family was home. There were always the lights of the parlour and the dining room visible from the street, the warm amber glow of rooms in use pressing through the gap in the shutters. But the house was unlit from ground floor to rooftop, presenting to the street a blind and silent face that gave Lancelin pause at the gate. He stood there for a moment in the cold evening air, looking up at the darkened windows, and then he went to the door and found it locked from the inside. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again with more force, and stood in the silence of the street listening for movement within, and heard nothing. What he felt in those moments, the precise quality of the apprehension that began to form in him as he stood at his own locked door in the dark, is not recorded. He was a solicitor, a man trained to precision and to the measured assessment of situations, and it is possible that what he felt at first was simply irritation, the practical irritation of a man who cannot get into his own house before the darker possibility began to form. The dark windows, the silence, the locked door, the fact that his wife and daughter had been expected home from their afternoon call, and that the lights of the house that should have confirmed their presence were absent. He went to the Reynard house, the family his wife and daughter had been visiting, to inquire whether they had left at the expected hour. They had. Monsieur Renard confirmed that Léonie and Geneviève Lancelin had departed some time in the late afternoon, at approximately the time one might expect them to be arriving home. They had been in good health and good spirits. There was nothing to account for their absence from the house. Lancelin returned to the Rue Bruyère. The house was still dark, still silent, still locked against him. It was at this point that he summoned the police. The commissaire who responded to the call was accompanied by officers, and they approached the house on the Rue Bruyère in the manner of men who anticipate a domestic irregularity, rather than a catastrophe, a servant who had neglected to leave the door on the latch perhaps, or some minor electrical mishap that had left the house temporarily uninhabitable, and its occupants briefly displaced. The most straightforward explanations are usually the correct ones, and the house on the Rue Bruyère was not a house from which catastrophe was expected. It was a house in a quiet street in a provincial city that nothing ever happened in. The officers forced entry. The ground floor was empty. The kitchen was cold. The stove had gone out, suggesting that no one had attended to it in the last several hours. The rooms were in order, or sufficiently in order that nothing in them constituted an immediate alarm. The officers moved to the staircase and ascended to the first floor. What the light of their lanterns revealed on the first-floor landing stopped the assembled officers where they stood. The bodies of Léonie Lancelin and Geneviève Lancelin were on the floor. They had been subjected to violence of an extreme and sustained nature. The physical evidence of the attack covered the landing and the adjacent walls with a thoroughness that spoke to the duration and intensity of what had occurred. The details entered the official police report, and from there entered the newspapers, and from there entered the consciousness of France. And they are not details that require repetition in their full specificity here. What needs to be conveyed is the impact of the discovery by professional men who had entered dozens of crime scenes, and who were, by training and experience, equipped to encounter violence, and who found themselves nonetheless stopped on the landing of a house in Le Mans by what was in front of them. The bodies had been there for some hours. The eyes, Madame Lancelin's eyes and Geneviève's eyes, were on the floor of the landing, placed there with a deliberateness that was among the first things the investigating officers noted and could not account for. This detail lodged itself immediately in the understanding of every person who encountered it, because it spoke to something that the violence itself, however extreme, did not quite speak to on its own. The violence could be, if not explained, then at least categorized, placed within the range of things that human beings under extreme pressure had been known to do to one another. The placement of the eyes was something else. It had a quality of intention, of symbolic weight, of meaning that the available frameworks did not adequately contain. The rest of the house was as it always was. The parlour was undisturbed. Madame Lancelin's glass cabinet of small decorative objects stood closed and in order. The dining room was set for the evening meal, the silver that Christine had polished catching the light of the officers' lanterns in the way that well-maintained silver does, sending small bright reflections moving across the walls. The kitchen was cold and still, the stove dark, the day's preparation abandoned at the point where the afternoon had changed. The officers ascended to the second floor. Nothing. They ascended to the attic. The door to the attic rooms was barricaded from the inside. The sound of the officers' arrival on the upper landing produced from behind the door the sounds of movement, human movement, the sounds of two people in a small room. The officers called out, identified themselves, demanded that the door be opened. There was a pause, and then the sound of furniture being moved, and then the door opened. Christine and Léa Papin stood in the attic room in the dim light that came through the small window above the street. They were dressed. They were composed. The room showed signs of their recent occupation. The iron bed with its grey linen, the basin and ewer that had been used, the chest that had been moved from the door and now stood slightly out of its position, the chair pushed back against the wall. Christine spoke first. There are varying accounts of the precise words she used in this first moment of contact with the police, but all accounts agree on the substance. She did not attempt to deny what had happened. She did not feign confusion or ignorance. She looked at the officer before her and she told him, in the flat, composed manner that she would maintain through every subsequent interrogation, that it was she and her sister who had done this thing, and that they were responsible for what was on the landing below. The officers, by some accounts, were briefly unable to respond. The composure was not what they had expected. The clarity was not what they had expected. The willingness to speak, the immediate, voluntary accounting for the thing done, was not what they had expected from two women standing in an attic room above the worst thing that had happened in this city in living memory. Christine and Léa were taken into custody without resistance. They descended the stairs. The back stairs, the stairs they had always used. The servants' stairs that ran alongside but separate from the main staircase of the house. And they passed the first-floor landing, and they were escorted through the kitchen and out through the door and into the cold air of the Rue Bruyère, which by now held a gathering of neighbours drawn by the presence of the police, their faces pale and uncertain in the winter dark. The news spread through Le Mans with the speed that news of extraordinary things always spreads through provincial cities. By the following morning, it was in the newspapers. Within days, it was in the Paris papers. Within a week, it was across France, and then beyond France, and the house on the Rue Bruyère, which had never been anything other than one unremarkable stone house among the many unremarkable stone houses of a provincial city that nothing ever happened in, had become the centre of an attention it was not built to receive. Monsieur Lancelin identified the bodies. He was, by the accounts of those present, a man moving through a state that had no available language, the state of a person for whom the ordinary structures of comprehension have temporarily failed, for whom the world has presented something that the available categories cannot process. His wife. his daughter. The landing of his house. The silver still bright in the lantern light. The investigation was opened immediately, and it was, in the mechanical sense, almost immediately closed. There was no question of the perpetrator's identity. There was no mystery to resolve, no trail to follow, no suspect to locate. The suspects had been found in the attic and had identified themselves. The physical evidence was comprehensive and unambiguous. The case was, from the perspective of criminal investigation, one of the simplest that the Le Mans police had ever encountered. It was in every other respect, in the sense of what it meant, what had produced it, what its existence revealed about the world that had contained it, one of the most difficult. The examining magistrate was a man named Goddard, and he was summoned to take Christine's statement the following morning. He went to the cell where she had spent the night, prepared for the range of responses that interrogation of murder suspects tended to produce. Denial, confusion, the deflections of fear and self-preservation, the fog of a mind that has done something it cannot yet fully absorb. He found a woman sitting quietly on the edge of the cell's wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for him. She told him everything. Chapter 8. The confession. The interrogation room in the Le Mans commissariat was a plain place. Stone walls. A table. Chairs. A window that admitted a quantity of winter light insufficient to make the room feel anything other than what it was. A room designed to hold difficult conversations in conditions that offered no comfort and no distraction. Christine Papin sat across the table from Magistrate Goddard on the morning of the 3rd of February 1933, and she spoke with the composure of someone who has passed through the worst of what can happen, and arrived on the other side of it in a state of terrible clarity. She had spent the night in the cell without apparent distress. The officers who had monitored her through the night reported that she had slept, or had at least lain still in the manner of someone who has made peace with their circumstances, which is not precisely the same thing, but is close enough that the distinction barely mattered by morning. She had eaten the bread that was brought to her. She had washed her face and hands in the basin provided. She was dressed, and her hair was arranged, and when Magistrate Goddard entered the room, she looked at him with a steadiness that he would later describe in his notes as entirely without defiance. It was not the look of a woman bracing herself or performing a posture of strength, but the look of a woman who had simply arrived at a place where certain questions had ceased to have any answer other than the truth. Goddard began, as procedure required, with the formal questions. Name, age, place of birth, duration of employment in the Lancelin household. The dates confirmed: Christine Papin, born 8th of March 1905. She had been in the employ of the Lancelin family for approximately 6 years. She had been joined in that employment by her sister Léa, who had served alongside her throughout that period. Then Goddard asked about the 2nd of February. Christine told him about the iron, the fuse, the darkness in the upper rooms, the sound of Madame Lancelin and Geneviève returning, the opening of the front door, the footsteps on the stairs. She described the exchange on the landing in the plain language of reported fact, without elaboration, without the colouring of emotion either in the direction of regret or in the direction of justification. Madame Lancelin had spoken to her about the darkness, had expressed her anger at the failed lights in the manner that Christine recognised, the flat, controlled manner of a woman whose displeasure was a form of authority, whose expressions of dissatisfaction were also always exercises of power. And then? Goddard asked. And then, Christine said, she had taken the pot lid and she had struck her. She described the sequence of events that followed with a precision that Goddard noted carefully. She identified each instrument used. She accounted for her own actions and for Léa's actions separately, and she was consistent throughout in assigning to herself the primary role and to Léa the secondary one. Léa had followed, had assisted, but it was Christine who had begun it, and Christine who had cummed it, and Christine who had carried it through its most extreme stages. The gouging of the eyes. She accounted for this directly, without apparent difficulty, as something she had done with deliberateness. She offered no explanation for it that Goddard was able to record as a coherent motive. It was something she had done. It had seemed, in the moment, to be what was required. The phrase "what was required" sits at the centre of Christine the confession, like a stone in still water. It is the phrase of a woman trained to the satisfaction of requirements. The entire architecture of her life in service had been organised around the concept of what was required, what the standard demanded, what the situation called for. And in the moment on the landing, in the dark house with the familiar voice delivering the familiar dissatisfaction. What had presented itself to her as required was what she had done. This is not an explanation. It is an account. There is a difference, and the difference is important, and the legal proceedings that followed would spend considerable time attempting to bridge the gap between the two, attempting to determine whether the account was also, in any legally or psychiatrically meaningful sense, an explanation, and whether that explanation bore on the question of Christine Papin's responsibility for her actions. Léa was interrogated separately. The contrast between the two interrogations was noted by every observer who was present for both, and it illuminates the dynamic between the sisters as clearly as any other single piece of evidence. Where Christine was composed, Léa was uncertain. Where Christine was precise, Léa was vague. Where Christine accounted fully for her own actions and took deliberate responsibility, Léa's account had the quality of a woman describing events that had happened to her rather than events in which she had participated. The grammar of a passive presence, someone carried along by a force she had not initiated and could not fully account for. Léa confirmed the substance of Christine's account. She did not contradict it. She added details that Christine had omitted, mostly details of the secondary kind, what she herself had done, how she had assisted, how long the events of the landing had lasted. But she did not, in any meaningful sense, offer an account that was independent of Christine's account. She was telling the same story from the position of the person who had been present but had not been the author. When Goddard asked Léa why she had joined her sister in what had been done, Léa's response, paraphrased in Goddard's notes, was one of the most significant moments of the entire investigation. She had done it, she said, because Christine had done it, because Christine was there, because when Christine moved, she moved with her, because that was how things were between them. This answer is not a legal defense. It is not an absolution. It is a description, rendered in the plainest possible terms, of the bond that had structured both women's lives since childhood, the bond that had substituted for everything else, that had been their entire social world, their entire emotional landscape, their only source of the particular warmth that human beings require. When Christine moved, Léa moved with her. This was not obedience in the military sense, not coercion in the legal sense. It was something older and more structural than either of those things, something that had been laid down in the dormitories of Le Bon Pasteur long before either of them was old enough to understand what kind of structure they were building. The alienists were brought in within days of the arrest. The examining magistrate was required, under French criminal procedure, to have the mental state of the accused assessed before the case could proceed to trial, and the alienists, court-appointed medical men with specialist training in the assessment of mental capacity and criminal responsibility, arrived at the Le Mans commissariat with their notebooks and their diagnostic frameworks and their diagnostic frameworks and their diagnostic frameworks and their didactic frameworks and their didactic frameworks and their professional certainty that whatever had happened on the landing of the Bruyère, Dr. Logray was the most prominent of those who examined Christine. He spent considerable time with her, engaging in the extended interviews that French forensic psychiatric practice of the period required, and his conclusions were nuanced and not entirely consistent. The nuance being a product of the genuine difficulty of the case, the inconsistency being a product of the genuine difficulty of the case, the inconsistency being a product of the pressure the case was generating on everyone who touched it. He found in Christine evidence of what the period psychiatric vocabulary described as a paranoid constitution, a particular arrangement of the psyche that was not, in his assessment, psychosis in the full clinical sense, but was not ordinary sanity either. It occupied a middle ground that French law, which distinguished sharply between those who were legally responsible for their actions and those who were not, was not well designed to accommodate. Léa was assessed as functioning primarily as an extension of Christine's will, not a clinical formulation, but a descriptive one, and it appeared in the official assessments with a consistency that suggested it was the only description that adequately fitted what the alienists observed in their sessions with her. She was, in the judgment of the medical men, a less complete personality than her sister, not in the sense of lower intelligence or lesser capability, but in the sense of a self that had never fully differentiated from the person around whom it had organized itself. Christine, when informed of the alienists' conclusions, responded with the same composed precision she brought to everything. She did not dispute the assessments. She did not argue for her own sanity. She simply noted in the flat declarative manner of a woman who has said everything that needs to be said and is waiting for the consequence, that she had done what she had done, and that she understood what was to come. What was to come was the trial. And the trial, when it arrived, would bring to Le Mans and then to France, and then, in the manner of extraordinary things, far beyond France, a reckoning with the questions that the house on the Rue Bruyère had raised, and that the interrogation room and the alienists' reports had not, for all their thoroughness, quite answered. Chapter 9. The Trial of the Century. The Assize Court of the Sarthe convened to try the Papin sisters in September of 1933, 7 months after the events of February, and the city of Le Mans received the proceedings with the intensity of attention that provincial cities direct toward events that have disturbed the foundations of their self-understanding. The courtroom was full. It had been full at every session of the preliminary proceedings, and it was full now at the trial proper, with the particular quality of fullness that attends events of this kind, not the idle fullness of entertainment, though entertainment was certainly part of what the audience sought, but the charged fullness of a community gathered to process something it has not yet been able to process, to look directly at the thing it has been looking at indirectly for 7 months, and to receive, in the form of a verdict and a sentence, the official word on what it means. The journalists had been there for months. The Paris papers had sent correspondence in the days following the arrest, and those correspondents had remained, filing reports that ranged from the factually meticulous to the luridly embellished, their dispatches feeding a readership whose appetite for the case showed no signs of diminishing. The Papin sisters had become, in the months between the arrest and the trial, something larger than themselves, had become a site where France's anxieties about class, about gender, about the domestic interior and its hidden contents, about the women who kept the houses of the bourgeoisie and what they thought in the private hours above those houses, could be projected and examined and argued over. Simone de Beauvoir wrote about the case. Jean Genet would draw from it, eventually, the material for Les Bons, the theatrical work in which 2 maids rehearsed the murder of their mistress in the stolen hours of her absence. Jacques Lacan, who was at this period of his career developing the theoretical framework that would eventually make him one of the century's most influential thinkers on the subject of the human psyche, published a commentary on the case in a surrealist journal, bringing to it the vocabulary of the emerging discipline in which the Papin sisters became, briefly, something like case material. The French intelligentsia, in short, found in this case a mirror, and held it up to itself with a fascination that said at least as much about the intelligentsia as it said about the 2 women in the dock. The 2 women in the dock were thin. The 7 months of detention had reduced both sisters, Christine more noticeably than Léa. Christine had not eaten consistently during her imprisonment. She had, in the months following the arrest, undergone episodes of what her prison medical attendants described as acute disturbance, periods of agitation, and what appeared to be auditory experience of an unusual character, during which she spoke of things that the prison chaplain and the medical staff found difficult to categorize within the available frameworks. She had asked at one point to be put to death immediately. She had at other points been calm and clear and entirely in command of her account of events. The oscillation between these states was itself a data point that the alienists attempted to incorporate into their formal assessments, with varying degrees of success. The separation from Léa had been, for Christine, the condition she had never been required to endure before, and for which she had no preparation. They had never been separated, not since Léa's entry into the institutional system had placed them in proximity, not across the years of their shared domestic life, not in the aftermath of the murders when they had lain together in the attic above the landing. The walls of the prison had divided them, placed them in separate cells and separate corridors, subjected them to isolation from each other. That was, for Christine, simply the most extreme version of the deprivation she had always feared, the deprivation of the one relationship that constituted her entire interior world. Léa, in the separation, contracted inward. The observers who saw her in the months between the arrest and the trial noted a quality of suspension, as though the self that had always been organized around Christine was waiting, in Christine's absence, for the organizing principle to return, unable in the meantime to quite constitute itself independently. She ate. She slept. She responded to questions in the flat, cooperative manner of a person accustomed to responding to authority. But she was, in any fuller sense of the word, absent. The presiding judge was a man named Maids. He was experienced in the criminal proceedings of the assize court, familiar with the full range of what human beings are capable of doing to one another, and he conducted the trial with a procedural efficiency that the extraordinary nature of the case did not disrupt. Evidence was presented. The police reports were read into the record. The alienists gave their testimony. The lawyers for the defense appointed, since neither sister had any resources, made the arguments available to them within the framework of French criminal law. The defense argument rested primarily on the question of Christine's mental state, on the conclusions of the alienists who had found in her evidence of a constitution that was not, in the fullest clinical sense, normal. The argument was not that Christine had been unaware of what she was doing. She had demonstrated comprehensive awareness throughout, from the confession onward. The argument was that the architecture of her psyche, shaped by the deprivations of childhood and the years of isolation in domestic service, had produced a person whose capacity for what the law required of a responsible agent, for the kind of self-regulation that prevents the translation of impulse into action, had been compromised in ways that the standard categories of criminal responsibility did not adequately capture. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Christine had acted with deliberateness. She had used specific instruments. She had sustained the violence across an extended period. She had demonstrated, in her confession and in her subsequent behavior, full comprehension of what she had done and why it was prohibited. She was responsible. The law required that she be held responsible. The alternative, the position that a person of compromised constitution could not be held accountable for their actions, was not a position that the legal framework supported or that the interests of order and justice could accommodate. The jury was composed of men. This was the practice of the era, and it meant that the 12 people charged with determining the fate of Christine and Léa Papin were 12 men of the provincial bourgeoisie of the Sarthe, men whose households were, in all probability, structured precisely as the Lancelin household had been structured, whose domestic arrangements rested on the same foundations of invisible labour and unacknowledged service, whose wives and daughters moved through rooms that other women kept clean. Whether this composition of the jury had any bearing on the verdict is a question that the historical record invites, but cannot definitively answer. Christine was found guilty of murder. The verdict was returned without qualification, without any formal accommodation of the alienists' findings regarding her mental state, without any movement in the direction of diminished responsibility. She was sentenced to death by guillotine. Léa was found guilty as an accessory to murder. She was sentenced to 10 years of hard labour. The sentencing of Christine produced in the courtroom a range of responses that the newspaper correspondents recorded with varying degrees of accuracy and varying degrees of their own perspective. Some accounts described Christine as receiving the death sentence with the same composure she had brought to everything, sitting straight, hands folded, the smooth surface maintained against the worst that the court could direct at her. Other accounts described a different quality, not distress exactly, but a settling into something, a quality of weight absorbed and held rather than deflected. What Christine said when the sentence was pronounced was not recorded verbatim in all accounts, but the substance is consistent. She asked about Léa. Specifically, she asked what would happen to Léa, where Léa would be sent, whether Léa would be safe. In the final calculation, in the moment when the court had delivered the most extreme penalty available to it, the question that rose to Christine's lips was not about herself, but about her sister. This detail, small and precise and entirely in keeping with everything the case had revealed about the bond between the two women, was noted by several of the journalists present and left them, by their own accounts, briefly without the language appropriate to what they had observed. The sentence was subsequently commuted. The formal death sentence on Christine Papin was reduced to life imprisonment with hard labour, the commutation coming through the processes of review that applied to capital cases in France and reflecting, perhaps, some official discomfort with the execution of a woman whose mental state had been the subject of such extensive and unresolved expert debate. Christine was transferred to the prison at Rennes, where she would serve her sentence in the continuing absence of the only person who had ever constituted her world. The courtroom in Le Mans emptied. The journalists filed their final dispatches. The house on the Rue Bruyère was locked, its shutters drawn against the autumn light, its rooms in the darkness and silence that they would maintain for a very long time. France moved on after a fashion. There were other anxieties to attend to. The depression deepening, the political atmosphere darkening, the distant rumblings of the continental catastrophe that was still some years away. The Papin case receded from the front pages and settled into the longer memory that extraordinary things occupy when the immediate noise around them has died down. the memory of libraries and court records, and the conversations of those who had been present in that courtroom and who would carry what they had witnessed there for the rest of their lives. Chapter 10. What remained there is a particular kind of ending that history reserves for those it has already consumed, not the ending of resolution, of justice arriving at its proper destination, and the world resuming its ordinary motion, not the ending of understanding, in which the thing that happened is finally explained to the satisfaction of those who witnessed it. The ending that history reserved for Christine and Léa Papin was of a quieter and more pitiless kind, the ending of simple continuation, of time moving forward through its increments regardless of what it carried, of the world accommodating what had happened, not by making sense of it, but by growing accustomed to it, the way that stone grows accustomed to the weight it bears, until the weight and the stone become indistinguishable. Christine Papin arrived at the prison at Rennes in the autumn of 1933, carrying nothing of significance. The personal effects of a woman who has spent her adult life in domestic service and then in prison are not numerous. There were, perhaps, the clothes she wore and the few items of toiletry that the prison system permitted. There was, in the record, no book, no letter, no photograph, no object that carried within it any life before the walls. The trunk that had accompanied two sisters to the house on the Rue Bruyère years earlier, the single trunk of belongings, the brown paper envelope of references, the proof of a previous existence, was not with her. That life was over, and its artifacts had dispersed into the custody of a system that had no particular interest in preserving them. The prison at Rennes was a stone building in the manner of all prisons. Its interior a world of regulated time and regulated space. Its architecture designed to make the fact of confinement unmistakable at every moment of the confined person's day. Christine had been confined before, in a sense, had been confined in the attic rooms of the Rue Bruyère, confined by the architecture of domestic service, confined by the invisible walls of a life that had no exit. The stone walls of Rennes were, in the literal sense, more absolute. But the experience of confinement was not, perhaps, as foreign to her as it might have been to a woman who had moved freely through a larger world. What was foreign, what constituted the genuine cruelty of Christine's imprisonment, beyond the formal severity of its conditions, was the absence of Léa. The prison medical records from the years following Christine's arrival at Rennes document a deterioration that was observed with clinical accuracy and met with the limited resources available to institutional medicine of the period. Christine stopped eating with consistency. She slept poorly, or slept too much, or alternated between the two in patterns that the medical staff found difficult to manage. She spoke, at intervals, of Léa, not in the distressed manner of someone overwhelmed by separation, but in the matter-of-fact manner of someone referring to an aspect of their life that is simply true, simply present, that has not been altered by the physical fact of distance. She asked about Léa's conditions, about whether Léa was being properly cared for, about what Léa was eating, and whether the cell she occupied was adequately heated in the winter months. The staff answered what they could and deflected what they could not, and Christine received their answers with the same composed neutrality she had brought to everything, and asked again the following week, and the week after that. The episodes that had begun during the pre-trial detention intensified in Rennes. Christine experienced, with increasing frequency, periods in which she was not entirely present in the ordinary sense, periods in which she described things that were not visible to those around her, spoke to people who were not in the room, moved through the world of the prison with the particular quality of someone navigating a landscape that overlays the visible one. The prison chaplain, who visited her regularly in the first years of her imprisonment, noted in his own records that Christine in these episodes had a quality he found difficult to name. It was not the distress of a person in pain, not the agitation of someone in crisis, but something that reminded him, he wrote, of the quality of a person in deep prayer, present to something invisible. Whether this was psychosis in the clinical sense, whether it was the specific manifestation of the paranoid constitution the alienists had identified, whether it was the response of a particular kind of mind to a particular kind of deprivation, these questions were not resolved by the medical staff at Rennes, because they were not resolved by the medical staff at Rennes, because they were not resolvable with the tools available to them, and because the category into which Christine's condition most accurately fitted was a category that 19th and 20th century had been working to trunct for decades and had not yet finished builded. She asked in the middle years of her imprisonment to enter a religious order. This request was considered and declined by the relevant authorities for reasons that the record does not fully specify, but that can be inferred from the circumstances. A woman convicted of double murder, whose sentence had been the subject of public controversy, whose case had generated political and intellectual debate across France, was not, in the judgment of those who administered the church's institutional life, an appropriate candidate for religious enclosure. The request was noted and declined, and Christine received the declining in the manner she received everything. By the middle 1930s she had become, by the accounts of those who encountered her in the prison, a diminished thing. Not diminished in the sense of broken. There was in Christine, even in the worst of her decline, a quality of self-possession that survived everything the years imposed on it. Diminished in the purely physical sense. She was thin, thinner than she had been. The strong frame that had carried coal scuttles and wielded flat irons reduced by years of inconsistent eating and the particular physical toll of confined existence. She moved slowly. She spent much of her time in the posture of someone waiting, seated, still, hands folded in the way they had been folded in the interrogation room across from Magistrate Goddard, in the way they had been folded in the dock when the jury returned its verdict. Christine Papin died on the 18th of May 1937 in the hospital of the Hôtel Dieu at Rennes. She was 32 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as exhaustion and cachexia, the wasting condition that is the body's final accounting for sustained neglect of itself. She had been alive, in the full functional sense, for fewer years than most people have between their entry into the world and their first significant memory. She had been, for the last 4 years of those years, alone. Léa Papin's story did not end in Rennes. Léa had been sentenced to 10 years of hard labour, and she served her sentence with the compliance that had characterised everything she had ever done in the presence of authority. She was, by the prison records of the period, a cooperative prisoner, not animated, not particularly engaged with the life of the institution around her, but present and manageable and meeting the requirements of the regime without friction. She ate what was given to her. She performed the labour assigned to her. She answered questions when asked and did not draw attention to herself in either direction. She was in the prison as she had been in the house on the Rue Bruyère, and before that in the institution of Le Bon Pasteur, adequately invisible. She learned of Christine's death through the institutional communication that prisons maintain. A notification, a formal acknowledgement, the administrative record of the fact. What passed through Léa in the moment of that notification is not available to the historical record, because Léa had always kept her interior life as invisible as Christine had kept hers, and the prison offered no mechanism for its documentation. What is recorded is that Léa, in the days following the notification, was observed by prison staff to be quiet, not in the ordinary way of her quietness, but in a particular quality of stillness that one of the staff members, in a note that survives in the institutional archive, described as the stillness of a person from whom something essential has been removed. She was released in 1941, having served 8 years rather than the full 10, in the manner of prisoners whose conduct has been consistently without incident. She left the prison in the early spring of that year, in the middle of the German occupation of France, into a country that was sufficiently preoccupied with its own catastrophe to have largely forgotten the case that had occupied its attention 8 years earlier. She assumed a new name, or was given one, or was assisted in assuming one. The record is not clear on the mechanism. And she went to Nantes with Saint-Pellice where she found work, and she lived. She worked, in Nantes, in the only capacity for which she had been trained. She kept house. She cooked and cleaned and pressed linen, and carried things from one room to another, and made surfaces clean, and maintained the standards required by the people who employed her. She did this with, by all accounts, the same competence and quiet efficiency that had made her an adequate domestic servant in Le Mans, in the house on the Rue Bruyère, in the life before the 2nd of February 1933. She grew older. She lived under her assumed name in the manner of someone who has been given a second life, and is using it with the careful, undemonstrative tenacity of a person who knows the cost of the first one. She was still alive in the 1950s. There are accounts, unverified, second or third hand in their provenance, of a journalist who located her in Nantes in that decade and attempted to secure an interview, and of Léa declining, simply and without drama, in the way she had always declined what she did not wish to do, by not doing it, and not explaining why she was not wished to do, by not doing it, and not explaining why she was not doing it, and waiting for the person who required an explanation to give up and go away. The journalist, by the account, gave up and went away. Léa continued her life. The house on the Rue Bruyère stood. Houses tend to outlast the events they contain. They are built for continuity, for the ordinary succession of occupants and uses, and the violence done within them is absorbed into the walls in a sense that is metaphorical, but feels, to those who know the history, like something more. The house was eventually reoccupied, its rooms re-inhabited by people who came after, who used the kitchen and polished the floors and ascended the stairs, the main staircase, the back staircase, the attic stairs, without the knowledge of what had used those stairs before them. The case entered the cultural record in the way that cases of its particular resonance do, not through any single authoritative account, but through the accretion of responses to it, the plays and the essays and the theoretical frameworks and the films that came later, each one attempting to find in the facts of the 2nd of February 1933 the explanation that the facts themselves, examined plain, did not yield. Jean Genet's Les Bonnes, first performed in 1947, took the situation, two maids, a mistress, the domestic interior as a theatre of suppressed violence, and stripped it of its factual particularity to find beneath it a structure that he considered universal, the structure of servitude, of performance, of identity constituted in the relation between the powerful and the powerless, of the role-playing that is required of those who must be permanently other than they are. Whether the Papin sisters would have recognized themselves in Genet's treatment is a question that cannot be answered, and perhaps should not be pressed too hard. Christine was dead before the play was written. Léa was alive and silent, in Nantes or wherever she was by then, declining all invitations to be interpreted. The alienists question, was Christine Papin mad in a sense that bore on her responsibility for what she had done, was never definitively resolved, and it has remained unresolved in the decades since, a permanent condition of the case's afterlife. French law then as now required a binary answer to a question that the evidence of the Rue Bruyère refused to provide in binary form. The truth of Christine's mental state, if it was accessible at all, was accessible only from the inside, from the interior that she had always kept smooth and unreadable, that had never been opened to inspection in the way that Madame Lancelin's surfaces had been opened to inspection, that had been the one space in her entire life that belonged absolutely to herself. What the case left behind, beyond the legal records and the intellectual responses and the cultural responses and the cultural artifacts, was a question about the nature of invisible lives, about what accumulates in people who are required to be invisible, what builds of years in the space between the person who is seen and the person who is not seen, between the surface presented to the world and whatever lies beneath it. The Rue Bruyère was not the only house in France, or in Europe, or in the world, that contained within its orderly bourgeois interior a servant sleeping in an attic above the family she served, rising before them, retiring after them, keeping her hands busy and her face neutral and her interior life absolutely to herself. It was simply the house where the interior life finally made itself known, and in making itself known, destroyed everything. This is what the Papin case offered finally to France and to the history that received it. Not a lesson in the simple didactic sense, not a warning that admitted easy prevention, but an image. The image of two women in an attic, lying together on an iron bed in the cold, waiting for footsteps on the stairs. The image of a landing, and a darkness, and a house full of the silence of something that had been held too long, and had finally found release. The image of Christine's hands folded in her lap in the interrogation room, calm as the surface of still water, containing everything and giving nothing away, even now. France moved through the rest of the 1930s and into the catastrophe of the 1940s, and the catastrophes that followed, and the catastrophes that displaced the Papin case from public memory as new anxieties superseded old ones. The journals where Lacan and the Surrealists had published their commentary were bound and shelved. The court records were filed. The prison at Rennes continued its operations. The house on the Rue Bruyère continued to stand. In Nantes, in the years after the war, a woman who had once been Léa Papin and was now something else, someone else, or trying to be, made her employers beds and polished their silver and pressed their linen and descended the back stairs to the kitchen in the mornings and lit the stove and waited for the day to begin. She was very quiet. She had always been very quiet. The stove ticked and sighed. The winter light came through the kitchen window, and in the stone-cold rooms of the Rue Bruyère, and in the closed records of the Assize Court of the Sarthe, and in the grave at Rennes, where Christine had been buried under a name that was simply her name, without ceremony, without a stoneman has ever been confirmed to survive. History exhaled, very slowly, and turned the page in the dark.